Okay, just one more video for you for this week. I'm just going to give you a little information that's relevant to the course material and thinking about kind of what controls vegetation, or the structure and function of vegetation in any particular location. And so I'm going to use this equation that's shown here to kind of as the backbone of what I'm going to talk about today, but really the backbone of our class. So in the early 1900s, Hans Jenny, he was a soil scientist in the United States. And a lot of kind of his ideas and discoveries are foundational to soil science and ecosystem science. And so he originally, in his 1941 publication that's listed here, he was thinking about and kind of postulated what the major controls were of soil formation. So what factors contributed to the type of soil in any given place. Not long after that, he kind of expanded that to the vegetation, because soils are so important to the vegetation, and vegetation can affect soil formation, that these things are really intertwined. And so eventually he came up with kind of this generic equation for what controls vegetation in any particular place. So V in this case stands for vegetation is equal to, or is a function of, that's the fancy F here, to these 6 factors. And so these 6 factors are climate, organisms, relief, soil, disturbance, and time. All right, sorry about the pause. I had to talk to my daughter for a second. So these are the 6 factors: climate, organisms, relief, soil, disturbance, time. I'm going to ask you this on the test, what those 6 factors are and to define each factor. So make sure you know the information from this lecture. My goal has always been, or my hope, I guess, has always been that everybody would be able to answer this question correctly at the end of the semester, and it has yet to happen. So maybe this is this semester. So I'm just going to talk through each of these things briefly so you can start to think about or see how I think about these factors affecting the vegetation, and you can start thinking about some examples of how these factors would impact what vegetation occurs on the landscape. So first is climate. So just as a very simple example, this is a map of precipitation across the United States. The dark red areas are the driest. The blue to purples are the wettest. And so this pattern of precipitation should seem familiar to you, where we have really wet places in the Pacific Northwest, really dry places in the desert Southwest or southwestern United States, and fairly moist areas in the eastern US. And if you know anything about the vegetation in these areas, it differs drastically from very sparse shrub and small herbaceous plants in the desert Southwest to fairly dense canopies in the east and really tall conifers in the western United States. And so that climate has a huge impact on what types of plants can grow. This example is really about precip, which is a large driver. Temperature also has a big impact as well. And we'll be continuing to talk about these throughout the semester. Let's talk about the O, organisms, what organisms are present. So here's just a few examples. So on the left is a picture of some grazers that are present on the landscape. So if those grazers would be removed, we would have a different set of plant species that might occur on that landscape. Similar with pollinators, some plants are reliant on very specific pollinators, and if those pollinators are not present, those plants are not present. Another example from my background is talking about the microbial community that exists in a place. So I mentioned in my introduction video that I worked on Biocon, which is the longest running biodiversity and climate change experiment. The longest running biodiversity experiment happens to be at the same location, and it's called Big Bio, and there's a picture of it there. What's interesting is these 2 experiments started really differently. Big Bio removed the top layer of soil and then planted the plants. And what they did that to get rid of the seed bank. However, they got rid of the microbial community, or a certain amount of the microbial community, and all the seeds. Biocon started by fumigating the soil and killing all the microbes, but not getting rid of the seed bank. And because of this difference in how they treated the microbial community, their biodiversity experiments differ in fairly significant ways. The general patterns are the same, but what species are actually present are different, even though they're in the exact same location. So just an example how not only large organisms, but the microbial community that we often, maybe we don't ignore, but we don't think about maybe as immediately, that can have a big impact as well. Okay, then another factor is relief or topography. You can use either term and you would get credit for both. But certainly here's some pictures looking at how the topography of the landscape changes, and you can actually see changes in the vegetation that coincide with the topography. So this picture in the upper right is in Yellowstone, and you can see the vegetation in these lowlands, these riparian areas. We have lots of willows. There's several different willows that occur along the riparian zones. But as you move up these slopes, we get sagebrush and a different set of grasses that dominate. So just that subtle difference in topography can have a big impact on what vegetation can grow there. Another example, or one of the other factors, is soils. So the type of soils, how fertile it is, what's the moisture holding capacity, those all have a big impact on what vegetation can grow there and how well it grows. I picked this picture because this person reminds me of my Uncle Bob. He would have done something like this to show I don't know what he would show, but he was always taking funny pictures like out in the field. So here's just an individual in the same general vicinity on a clay soil, and then a soil that is more mixed, like a loamy soil. And you can see the difference in productivity of corn on these two different soil types in the same place. And so that even though this is one species, you can see the difference in function, and then that can also affect the structure of the vegetation as well. One other factor is disturbance. And so we've got a couple different time scales of disturbances that you have to think about. So on the right, lower right, we've got a picture of a forest fire. Certainly recently we've had a little more impact of forest fires on us here in Fort Collins. So maybe something you're thinking about. And I never really thought I would get into the fire world, but I'm working with a colleague that is in Rapid City. This is Jackie Ah, a good friend of mine from my PhD. She is a scientist with the Forest Service up in Rapid City, and she's leading a project to look at the mortality of plants during fire in grassland ecosystems. So anyway, we've got fires, we've got droughts, we've got hailstorms, different types of what I would call disturbances that happen in a relatively recent time period. But we also have these really long-term disturbances to think about, or more historic in terms of geological time. So we had a lot of ice sheets and glaciers that covered parts of the United States, and that still has an impact on what vegetation is there today. So we can't just think in the last 10, 20, or even 100 years. We have to think about thousands of years ago and what disturbances were there on the landscape. And so that brings us to our last factor, which is time. How long has it been since that disturbance is a large component of what's on the landscape. As you know, there are successional processes or recovery processes after disturbances. And so where you're at in those recovery processes or succession is going to impact what vegetation is on the landscape. So if you don't know where you're at in time, you might not fully understand why a particular type of vegetation occurs on the landscape. So that is, you need to know this equation and be able to give an example of each of these 6 factors: climate, organisms, relief, soil disturbance, time. And when I'm thinking about examples, you think about, for climate, you might think about temperature and how temperature changes a lot from the south to north and how that affects what plants can grow in a particular area. Or you could think about the timing of precipitation. A place that has dry summers and wet winters might be look different than a place that has precipitation all year long. Okay, so, and then I just put up this or this slide to remind you that assignment 1 is going to be due next week, and it's related to this. It's a really simple assignment. Probably shouldn't take you more than like 10 or 15 minutes. As long as you do it, you're going to get full credit. So take a look at that assignment online. Let me know if you have any questions. But ultimately, I want you to, either in your own words or using a picture, provide an example of each of these factors, just as a way to like get them in your mind and start thinking and relating to these factors that we're talking about to your own perspectives and experiences. And that will just help you remember it for the rest of the semester and the exams. All right. That's it.